Everyone was taken aback by Jimmy Evans' unexpected statement. He finally made a statement regarding Joni Lamb after years of silence and conjecture. And fans are stunned by what he disclosed. The spotlight is now flooded with secrets, tension, and truth. Don't assume you already know the narrative. Everything is altered by this. What was said by Jimmy? Why now? What impact does that have on Joni's legacy, too? Hold on tight. The most startling incident recently made headlines. Jimmy Evans remained silent for years. He didn't publish, he didn't remark, and he didn't even imply his true feelings about what was going on at Daystar behind the scenes. He was simply a dependable friend of the Lamb family to the majority of people. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now, back to the topic. What we were talking about was someone who attended guest sermons, gave marital lessons, and supported Joni following Marcus's death. Then, however, everything was different. A leaked private discussion just days earlier showed a side of Jimmy Evans that nobody had anticipated. He broke the hush, and his words are appending the Christian media industry as a whole. Jimmy talks about an incident that still bothers him in the audio leak. A meeting inside Daystar, where the vibe was off from the start. It wasn't spiritual or serene, he remarked. It was controlled, tense, and eerie. He was seated across from Jonathan Lamb and Susie, who appeared emotionally spent. Then the startling moment arrived. Jimmy was requested to persuade Jonathan to obey his mother. Complete spiritual obedience, not regard or honor. As though Joni herself were God's voice, not only in the household but throughout the life of her grown son. Jimmy paused. He repeated the persuade Jonathan to obey his mother. Complete spiritual obedience, not regard or honor. As though Joni herself were God's voice, not only in the household but throughout the life of her grown son. Jimmy paused. He repeated the notion that Joni, who was inside Daystar, was the one speaking for God, even if he didn't want to. The part that won't go away is that because Joni, who is the voice of God, said those things with weight. They involved more than simply a mother and son. They dealt with control, spiritual authority, and power. Jimmy remained silent. He stated that without arguing. Susie and Jonathan also never forgot. That encounter turned into a tipping point. For them as well as for everyone who understood what actually transpired. Jimmy is now attempting to defend himself. According to friends, he regrets it. That he's at last understanding how twisted things have gotten. That it wasn't holy to strive to quiet Jonathan in order to keep the ministry safe at any costs. It was dangerous. In his heart, he knew something was wrong, but he believed he was helping. Jimmy is unable to turn back now that the truth is being revealed. His role as a guest preacher has evolved. He was present for what was taking place behind the scenes. Furthermore, his silence simply served to prolong the mask's wear. However, the mask is coming off. Having the guts to tell the truth and refuse to participate in a cover-up. Additionally, that has led to we have reached a point where we are totally independent, free from any kind of significant organization or authority, allowing us to speak out against injustice, stand up for the truth, and support those who have experienced abuse, hardship, or who have been a part of a culture that encourages people to hide things. Well, we're thrilled that we may be a force that can illuminate the darkness and provide room for the Lord to do a purifying act in Christ's body. Therefore, we would want to express our gratitude to everyone who has written to us, supported us, and shown us affection. It has simply been too much to handle. It was meant to be a time of healing, a time of quiet discussion, a time for the Lamb family to unite, confront their suffering, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to move on. However, the events of that day ultimately altered everything. For the people, not just the family. Who believed in the idea of a cohesive Christian household, had watched their broadcasts, prayed with them on television, and had been their followers for years. But behind the scenes, that image was already beginning to crumble. And during this family meeting, the truth finally slipped out. Susie Lamb and Jonathan Lamb had been silent for a while. Too much time. They had observed from a distance as Joni swiftly went on following Marcus' death, more quickly than anyone anticipated. They had endured uncomfortable meetings, sidestepped audience questions, and attempted to maintain their composure while everything around them seemed to be collapsing. However, they were unable to contain themselves this time. They required clarification. They required the truth. And at any costs, they were prepared to speak up. Jonathan then convened a meeting of the family. Face to face, without cameras or a boardroom. Everyone was invited. Spouses, siblings, and reliable sources. Unexpectedly, Joni also appeared. There was hope for a while. Perhaps she was prepared to listen at last. Perhaps she would take a seat, be honest, and acknowledge that the course had been thrown off. However, that moment was short-lived. Jonathan gave a brief explanation of his motivation for calling the meeting. He discussed the family's strain, their increasing separation, and the quiet that was causing them to drift away. He invited everyone to express their ideas, feelings, and worries. To be honest, not to criticize. Voices spoke, one after the other. Some were emotional, some were serene. However, they all shared a single characteristic. The family they used to know was missed. It was Joni's time next. Rather than sitting quietly and listening, she took an unexpected action. Setting a timer, she took out her phone. "You each have 60 seconds, she stated. Then I'm finished." People initially believed she was kidding, but she wasn't. Each participant has 1 minute. She only gave them that. A minute to describe years of spiritual disappointment, betrayal, hurt, and confusion. A minute to speak. All of the tension that had accumulated since Marcus' passing. When the final person finished speaking, she got up, surveyed the room, and declared that everyone was acting in terror. After that, she left. Your concern is to follow her instructions. You can't be here if you can't. No. No. I'm worried about it. No. No. You argue over everything, Jonathan. You must stop. I'm not debating. You are disputing everything. You must stop. And you both have to accept her authority at the end. Regarding Daystar Network, she is God's voice to you on this site. She is the voice of God. Either you give in or you go. That is the reality. The next time you guys are on, there will be a viewer comment regarding Doug, right? Therefore, there won't be any middle ground. You either submit and read it or you walk away. As simple as that. No follow-up, no prayers, no hugs. She needed to catch a flight too. She traveled to New York to visit Doug Weiss, whom she married a few months after Marcus' death. Joni then departed the room, permanently leaving the family emotionally for many. Then there was quiet. Stunned quiet. Jonathan knew what had happened as he glanced around the room. His mom wasn't prepared to speak. She had no desire to make amends. She had decided on something. Even worse, she had made the decision to distance herself from her closest loved ones. Something changed forever that day. There was more to the Lamb family than division. They were broken. Susie kept thinking about the meeting in the days that followed. She had. Usually respectful and cautious, but something inside of her had finally given out. Though she remained measured, she started to speak up more in public. She and Jonathan completely ceased to appear on Daystar programs. They were no longer faithful in their silence. It was a matter of survival. More folks were starting to pull away behind the scenes. The family's close friends began to distance themselves. Some discreetly offered Jonathan and Susie their support, stating that they were aware of what was occurring but were unsure of how to stop it. Others went even farther, such as Denise Boggs, a long-standing family acquaintance. Denise, a longtime ministry member who had previously counseled both Marcus and Joni, wrote a very intimate letter. She pleaded with Joni to change her course, to slow down, and to listen to God's voice rather than her own. However, Joni was not paying attention to her. The ministry was doing well. Her choices were sound. God had a purpose for her marriage to Doug Weiss. Even her own kid was viewed as rebellious or lost if he disagreed. That inflexible attitude is what caused the family to grow more distant. The individuals who had previously collaborated to create a Christian media empire were no longer even communicating. They used to pray together in the studio, but now it felt more like a war for power than faith. That family gathering took place in the midst of everything. The point at when everything fell apart when it could have turned around. After that meeting, Jonathan and Susie were not only devastated but also transformed. Now they realized that things would not return to normal. They were no longer able to feign. Additionally, the long-hidden truth about Marcus, Joni, and Daystar's inner circle was starting to come to light. What had been a family-based ministry has evolved into a warning story. Additionally, the individuals who had previously shared a smile on TV were now engaged in a quiet conflict. A conflict between power and healing, between image and truth. And that fateful family meeting was the beginning or the end of it all. Sometimes in life, everything is divided between a before and an after. That time arrived for the Lamb family when a sinister, long-forgotten secret came to light. For years, it had subtly tainted their base. And there was no turning back once it was out. Not to the image they had created on stage in front of millions of people, not to the love, not to the trust. Because there was something far heavier, something that had been suppressed for too long, beneath the lights, the music, the worship, and the smiles. It's Jonathan. He was usually referred to as the cool guy. Steady, devoted, and dedicated to his family and the Daystar mission. However, something that happened years before Marcus's death rocked him to his core. Something so terrible, so intimate, that it almost made him lose the will to speak. Jonathan thought his small daughter had been hurt by a family member. Nor sentimentally, nor both physically and spiritually. It's the kind of damage that no parent should ever experience. He didn't hold off. As any caring father would, he took the matter head on. He raised his voice. He probed. He insisted on answers. Above all else, he anticipated his parents. Marcus and Joni, to support him, to trust him, to keep their granddaughter safe. Instead, he received quiet, denial, and a choice that would permanently alter his connection with them. Daystar's patriarch, Marcus, dismissed it. He stated the family member was cleared after an internal probe. No police, no in-depth interrogation, simply a silent closure behind closed doors. The case is over. Although Jonathan was instructed to move on, he understood deep down that nothing had really been settled. His daughter's suffering was ignored, and to make matters worse, he was now blamed for his refusal to acknowledge it. Nor did Joni believe him. She refused to even entertain the possibility that her son might be telling the truth. She stood with Marcus and the accused. More than anything, that betrayal was painful. Jonathan felt abandoned as well as unheard. The woman who reared him, taught him the Bible, and advocated for the defense of the defenseless had abandoned her own granddaughter. Something broke between them after that. Years went by. The matter was not discussed. Not in public, at least. Susie and Jonathan made an effort to move on, but the wound never went away. And everything fell apart more quickly than anyone could have predicted once Marcus passed away. Joni didn't take her time mourning. She didn't talk through the unresolved pain or sit with her kids. Rather, she advanced quickly, too quickly. Additionally, she was already organizing her wedding to Doug Weiss just 2 months after losing her spouse. That marriage appeared strange, too abrupt, and too convenient to many. However, it was more than simply an odd choice to Jonathan and Susie. It was an obvious indication that Joni had completely let go of the past and had no plans to go back and revisit the suffering they had all buried. And that clarified one thing for them. It was time to talk. As a result, Things only became worse when Jimmy Evans was brought in for what was meant to be a healing meeting. Jonathan was asked to surrender to his mother rather than confront the past. She should be obeyed as though she were the voice of God, not only respected and heard. It wasn't about reconciliation. It has to do with control. And it was the last straw for Jonathan. No one ever accepted the reality of what had happened to his daughter. They never renewed the probe. When Susie and Jonathan looked more closely, they found that several details had been overlooked. Large objects. Things that may have been different. Everything would have been different if someone had genuinely cared. However, they didn't. And Joni, who ought to have been the most concerned, didn't pay attention. Once more, the consequences of that deception extended beyond the family. It got out. The ministry's long-standing friend Denise Boggs, who had previously given Joni and Marcus advice, learned of the situation. She was appalled. She had stood on platforms with the family, prayed with them, and supported them for years, but this was too much. In a letter to Joni and the rest of the family, Denise made a strong emotional plea. She wasn't merely worried in it. She warned. She said that Joni was being swayed. That the man she hurried to, Doug Weiss. Mary, he wasn't who he seemed. A wolf in sheep's clothing, she said. She claimed that the enemy was making fun of what God had created by using Daystar. And before it was too late, she pleaded with Joni to stop. Joni, however, continued. She didn't answer. And she turned to leave again. Not only from her kids, but also from anybody who dared to question the story she had written. Jonathan had to cope with the fallout. Susie was left to bear the responsibility. And the one at the core of it all, their daughter, was left with a reality that no child should have to face. Not only did that silence and that secret destroy the family. Everything was revealed. The TV grins, the love and unity sermons, the picture of the ideal Christian home. Everything started to seem phony. Because the suffering had been disregarded for so long, not because the faith wasn't genuine. The truth is now emerging. Painfully, slowly, but obviously. The individuals who used to stand side by side on stage are now separated by great distances. Some from tragedy, some by choice. However, it's all due to one thing, the unwillingness to confront the truth. This discovery was startling to many viewers. For those who knew the Lambs well, however, it clarified everything. Why did Jonathan leave? The reason behind Susie's departure from broadcasts. Why Joni seems more withdrawn and defensive than before. Everything led back to that hidden secret, Nobody wanted to acknowledge it, but today everyone knows the truth. The truth they refused to confront destroyed a family that had once preached truth. And all that made them strong was destroyed in the process. Their integrity, faith, and unity were all irreparably shattered. It took time for the Lamb family to disintegrate. It occurred one after the other, decision after decision, quiet after silence, until there was nothing left but mistrust, isolation, and a legacy based on both heartache and inspiration. Not everything happened at once. At first, the downfall happened slowly. At first, most people didn't even notice because it was so silent. The sermons continued, the lights remained bright, the messages sounded cheerful, and the smiles were still present. However, the core of the ministry was beginning to disintegrate behind the scenes. Furthermore, it was already too late when individuals grasped the true nature of the situation. A flourishing Christian foundation based on integrity, family, and faith was now collapsing under the weight of control, pride, and secrets. Daystar was more than a television network. It served as a haven of solace, a place of spiritual solace, and a reminder that even in God's word was still being preached by people who lived out their beliefs in a chaotic world. Joni Lamb was in the middle of that picture. She stood behind Marcus on stage for years, reading scripture, sharing personal anecdotes, discussing marriage and parenting, and grinning at each show. The audience had faith in her. They joined her in prayer. They had faith in her. However, the reality behind the curtain was quite different. Marcus Lamb's death caused a great deal of grief for many. He had represented strength and constancy. But while everyone was in grief, an unforeseen event occurred. Joni quickly and not only emotionally moved on. Even those closest to her were caught off guard by the decisions she started making. Months later, she declared her connection to Doug Weiss. Insiders saw it as more than a fleeting romance, but the general public saw it as such. It indicated that things had changed. People started to inquire. Why so quickly? Doug, why? And why was everything behind the scenes being kept so quiet? Initially, no one received responses. Joni did not panic. She remained on camera. She continued to preach. However, those who used to work next to her were vanishing. Her own son, Jonathan Lamb, moved aside. Susie, his wife, completely ceased showing up. Even ministry partners like Denise Boggs and close friends started to pull away. Additionally, some of them were either disregarded or ignored when they attempted to get in touch to express private concerns. Joni, however, persevered. She intensified her efforts. People were persuaded they were walking in dread if they questioned her choices. Those who ventured to voice their opinions were viewed as disloyal and occasionally even charged with insurrection. In actuality, though, they had no intention of rebelling. They were attempting to defend their perception of the ministry's values. Since Daystar wasn't intended to be about appearances, Jesus was supposed to be the subject. Nevertheless, it started to seem more and more like it was about Joni. The communication involving Jimmy Evans, a man who had participated in the incident, that was disclosed was the turning point. Lamb spent years in the inner circle. People were shocked to learn that he had instructed Jonathan to obey his mother as the voice of God within the ministry and to submit to her. This was more than a religious dispute. This had to do with power of control. The notion that someone could preach the gospel while on stage and then demand obedience behind closed doors, that was almost idolatry. What many had feared was validated by that one exchange. Not only was the ministry divided, one voice was in charge of it. And you were out if you didn't agree. The quiet got louder from there. Susie and Jonathan left because they could no longer pretend, not because they were resentful. Their choice wasn't produced in a gentle manner. After years of prayer, conflict, and heartache, it finally happened. However, they eventually came to the conclusion that the image was more significant than the reality. They realized it was time to leave at that point. They weren't alone, either. Employees began quitting in silence. Donors who had been contributing for years stopped. Invitations were declined by pastors who had previously featured on Daystar. Marcus's long-standing friends also started talking privately about their worries. What had once seemed like a divine movement now seemed more like a platform designed to silence the injured and defend pride. And individuals discovered more the more they searched. Tales of unsolved family conflicts, claims of supernatural influence, making decisions without advice, and Joni's. It was made worse by growing support for Doug Weiss, a guy with a complex past that included an abrupt divorce and doubts about his moral character. Nevertheless, Daystar continued to broadcast. Joni continued to smile, but there was a change in the atmosphere. People sensed it. There was no longer any transparency. The solidarity was gone. The ministry's heart was no longer pounding with the same cadence. The repercussions are now becoming apparent. What occurs when a ministry founded on reputation begins to falter? When the individuals you trusted the most are the ones who are hiding the most, what happens? It's not simply embarrassing for the public. It leads to spiritual misunderstanding. The faith of those who looked up to you is shaken. It raises questions. The worst part is that it hurts the very individuals you were meant to keep safe. That's what's going on right now. The world is attacking Daystar, yet it isn't falling apart. It's falling apart because the truth is at last showing through. Since those who were previously silent are now speaking up. Because the voices of displaced family members are finally being heard. And because it is no longer possible to overlook the weight of what has been concealed for years. The collapse isn't abrupt or dramatic. It's silent. It's sentimental. It has a spiritual component. It's also true. This has nothing to do with Joni's nasty nature. Blaming a single individual is not the solution. It's about what happens when accountability is subordinated to image. When spiritual authority is distorted into personal power, when healing is substituted with performance for the audience, followers, and believers, and when silence is employed as a means of control. This is painful, but it's also essential because, if something is falling apart on the inside, the truth will ultimately out, regardless of how lovely it appears on the exterior. And that's what we're currently witnessing. Slowly, painfully, but courageously, the truth rose. The picture is disappearing, and what's abandoned, that's what will decide if anything is still worth preserving.